From Microbe TV, this is TWiN, This Week in Neuroscience, episode number 45, recorded on November 30th, 2023. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast about the nervous system. Joining me today from Salt Lake City, Jason Shepard.
Hey, Vincent. Hey, Tim. How are you?
Okie dokie. And from New York, Tim Chung.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm doing okay, but also very jet lagged. So
just get back from Hong Kong, right?
Yeah, I got back 3 days ago, but every night I sleep at midnight and wake at 4 a.m. So I think
it's not bad.
Well, I like to sleep a little bit more. But I think this is like the perfect time to experiment with melatonin. So I'm going to try to get some
good luck
from the street. See what happens.
From the street? That sounds a bit dodgy.
Sorry, from the pharmacy.
Melatonin?
From the pharmacy.
Oh, pharmacy, okay.
the street in Hong Kong. Back street in Hong Kong.
All right. Today we're going to talk about acupuncture.
Right.
Tim's going to tell us the basis of acupuncture.
Well, probably not the basis, but I don't think anyone knows what the basis is. But the fact that it's even being studied, kind of it is scientifically studied, which is surprising to me. But a little bit of background. So I'm from Hong Kong. So I was born and raised within Chinese culture. So just based on, watching TV and, just being immersed in the culture, grown up in it, there are a lot of things that are kind of odd. One of them is Chinese medicine. One of the techniques that people use in Chinese medicine is, in fact, acupuncture. And for those who don't know what acupuncture is, it is the practice of sticking needles into specific points in the body. And it's usually, so I learn about all this on Wikipedia. I just see it on TV that people do it. They don't really explain what they're doing. They don't explain how it works. They just do it. And then the person who's, it's done to suddenly becomes better from any sort of illness. This is on TV, of course, in films and stuff. But what is supposed to happen, based on Wikipedia, is that there are identified so-called acupuncture points that a practitioner would learn, and then you stick needles into these acupuncture point, and then it would treat a variety of ailments. But I think the most popular one, most prevalent one that is used now is to treat pain, for pain management. So growing up, I kind of always dismissed this as completely just made up pseudoscience, because there is no basis for anyone to stick needles into yourself and suddenly feel better. And also, like, if you grew up in Chinese culture, or if you watch any Chinese films like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, these are the kind of these are Chinese medicine kind of. In Chinese medicine, you are able to press someone on certain points, and then that person would freeze in place, and then you can punch them from very far away using your chi. So that's that kind of nonsense that most people who are somewhat scientifically minded would rightfully doubt. So imagine my surprise when 1 year ago there was a paper published in Nature, which is one of the top journals in science, on using acupuncture, or at least a variant of acupuncture called electroacupuncture. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But electroacupuncture to treat sepsis. So that was very surprising. Did a spit take. And I wasn't going to do that paper because it was a little bit weird and it was a bit convoluted. But this time, I just got back from Hong Kong, where I attended my cousin's wedding, and his now wife is actually a medical doctor in Chinese medicine. So I thought, in celebration of the newlyweds, maybe it's time to actually look at acupuncture.
So Tim, can I ask you, I mean, this is a practice really widely done, right? Not just China, but the rest of the world.
So I
just think if something is so pervasive, there must be something to it, right?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. It's like most of these traditional medicines that stick around. There must be some kernel of truth to them.
Yeah.
There's huge placebo effects when people think something's going to help them, it'll help them. But this seems like something like no one really wants to have needles stuck into them. At least I don't know. It doesn't seem fun.
Exactly. And also, a couple of comments. One is, surprisingly, it is quite widely practiced. And I didn't find out until I Wikipedia'd this like 2 days ago. The place that has the most wide practice for acupuncture is not Asia, it's actually in Europe. So I don't know what's going on there. Maybe they are supposed to have good healthcare. So maybe some people just use it for acupuncture. The second thing is, just because there's no scientific basis, like as Jason said, placebo effect, can be quite big. So there's no scientific evidence that God actually exists, but many of us pray.
Yeah, it's true.
So we just don't know. But at least for acupuncture, and also another thing. So the main use for acupuncture is to relieve pain. And I was thinking about how this might, like, what would be the history of acupuncture, like how it, developed from many, many thousand years ago, I'm guessing. And one of the related field is actually, instead of sticking needles into specific points in your body, there's a related practice called acupressure, where there are also specific points in your body that you kind of massage or you kind of push against, and that would also alleviate supposedly some symptoms, for example, pain. And that might also sound completely crazy, but it is not too far a cousin of, when you're young and you fall over and you hurt your knee, your mom would maybe rub your knee, like kind of like gently rub it, and the pain would subside. And that actually has a pretty well-known mechanism where people have found that first of all, the nerves that conduct pain are separate from the nerves that conducts touch, that transmit touch. And if your pain nerve is activated by you falling over and there being an injury, if you touch areas surrounding it, the touch nerve signal can actually inhibit the pain signal, perhaps via inhibitory interneurons in the spinal cord, or perhaps via kind of going up to the brain and then some descending mechanism down back to the spinal cord. But in either case, the pain signal gets actually inhibited. It gets, the gate of it gets closed. So you can kind of imagine a long time ago, maybe someone figured that, I have a pain here. If I rub it around, the pain seems to subside. Oh, you know what? I'm going to stab myself with some needles and see what happens. So you can kind of picture maybe something like that kind of developing. But still, as far as I can tell, and if you Wikipedia acupuncture, so the practice of putting needles into specific body points, there is no obvious clinical evidence that it works for particular ailments. And people think it is perhaps pseudoscience. But there seems to be one thing that it actually does work on, and that is if you, and that's what we're going to talk about today, if you put needles, and these needles are usually metallic and also it's sterilized, you don't want to get an infection. If you put these metallic needles in specific points of your body, and then you pass an electric current, you stimulate it, it can actually modulate your immune system. So let's go to the paper that we're going to talk about today.
Which I don't, that to me, before we get into the paper, seems like that could work, right? We covered that one paper where it seems clear that there are circuits in the brain that can actually control the immune response for one. So and I think we're finding out more and more that there's sort of an interplay between the body and the brain, and that includes things like the immune system, where you would expect things to be quite autonomous. So the electrical induction seems more, that more likely that that's going to work than just sticking some random needle in somewhere.
That's right, and that's actually what they find, is that it actually does work. And
so you need the electrical.
You do need the electrical.
Right?
So we're going to talk about that in a bit. But in fact, the Nature paper that published last year actually identified the pathway that the needle actually stimulate, that travels through to the brain and then back down to your immune controlling organs. So how that actually controls sepsis. But that paper is a bit too involved. It's not very podcast friendly, let's put it that way. So the paper we are going to talk about today is kind of the origin paper of that Nature paper last year. The original paper was that started the whole thing, as far as I can tell, is the paper that we will talk about today, which is published in 2014, so almost 10 years ago now. And it is published in Nature Medicine, and is titled Dopamine Mediates Vagal Modulation of the Immune System by Electroacupuncture. And the first author, as far as I can tell, there's only one first author, and it's Rafael Torres Rosas. And the senior last author is Luis Ulloa. I'm so sorry if I mispronounce names. And at the time of publication, these authors are in Rutgers University, which is in New Jersey. I think now that I looked it up, the last author is now at Duke University, for those who want to look it up. But yeah, I think there's actually going to be an open access link that I will put in the show note, that for anyone who's interested can look up this paper. But for this paper, as the title mentioned, involves electroacupuncture, vagal modulation, and we'll dig into that in a bit. And the immune modulation is going to be in control of sepsis. So let's quickly talk about sepsis. Sepsis is a condition where your body is infected, and the infection is so severe and that it causes your immune system to go completely out of control, and it actually starts attacking your own body. So at the beginning of sepsis, there is a massive immunoactivated phase where the immune system is way too active. And then after that, it progresses to an immunosuppressant phase. And it is also during this phase that your organs start failing and necrosis takes place. So the way that sepsis, I think, and there's actually no, according to this paper, which is nine years old, so probably out of date, there's no approved treatment for sepsis by the US FDA.
I think that might still be true. Or I seem to recall seeing maybe some new ones on the horizon, but I don't know if there's been any approved drugs.
Yeah, perhaps not. Perhaps not. Maybe that's one of the reasons why something as out there as acupuncture is being explored. And that's surprising because apparently sepsis accounts for 10%, almost 10% of overall deaths in the US. So it is, and this is a big deal. Sepsis is, a big problem. And even though we have antibiotic and stuff like that, by the time you have sepsis that is developed, antibiotic will be too late. And it's possible that even things that suppress immune system, so many cytokines and different immune systems are activated that to suppress each one of them individually might also be very difficult. However, as we can see, as we're going to show in this paper, it seems like electroacupuncture might be a promising route, at least in mice, which is what this paper is going to focus on. So we're going to dig into the experiment. So these authors basically to tackle the question of whether sepsis can be affected by electroacupuncture, we first need to have a mouse model of sepsis. So the workhorse for most of the studies we're going to talk about, the workhorse of experimental sepsis that they would use is by injecting lipopolysaccharide, LPS, into the stomach or into the kind of stomach space, an IP injection. And LPS, this lipopolysaccharide, is basically a kind of purified bacteria cell wall that causes an immune response, is immunogenic. And previous studies have actually found that for a variety of kind of immunogenic conditions, including sepsis, it can be somewhat rescued or tempered by vagal nerve stimulation. So I don't know if the listeners have ever heard of vagal nerve stimulation. I think it's kind of a popular buzzword nowadays. But the vagal nerve actually is part of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is one of the two autonomic nervous system, which controls your internal organs. So the first one is the sympathetic nervous system, which controls your flight or fright response. And that is largely, that's largely associated with things like your adrenaline release, and also usually controlled by the neurotransmitter noradrenaline or norepinephrine in the US. And adrenaline is epinephrine. I might kind of swap between the two. Hopefully I would be consistently saying epinephrine. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system is kind of the opposite. And when you activate that system by activating the vagal nerve, you, instead of fright or flight or fight, you go into the rest and digest mode. So you kind of relax and your blood flows instead of to your muscles, to your organs, that kind of stuff.
Tim,
hello.
Tim, how do you do vagal stimulation?
So that is actually a very good question. Experimentally, to do vagal stimulation is invasive. So you have to somehow open up the patient or the animal and then isolate the vagus nerve. And vagus nerve also has very many branches. So you got to find the right branch of the vagus nerve and then stimulate it. And that actually limits its usefulness because it's invasive. And what this paper does is it's going to show, we're going to talk about it, as it happens, we can kind of indirectly stimulate the vagal nerve by targeting some of these acupuncture point, which I'm guessing got identified by accident. Like, I don't know how they were identified, but one of these acupuncture point, when you use electrostimulation via a needle, it actually stimulates some of the peripheral nerve. And in our case, it's going to be the sciatic nerve. And that, as it turns out, travels all the way up to the brain and then indirectly stimulate the nucleus inside the brain called the dorsal nucleus of the vagus. And that would stimulate the vagus nerve back down to control your parasympathetic nervous system. Sorry, I have a slight cough. Hopefully it won't happen too often. That is actually the goal of the or perhaps kind of a chance discovery of this paper, is that electroacupuncture serves as a pretty good non-invasive proxy of vagal nerve stimulation with beneficial outcome. So the first experiments that these authors did was they injected LPS, so this lipopolysaccharide that causes sepsis. And in addition to causing sepsis, they had a measure, kind of like a proxy measure of severity of sepsis. And they do that by taking the blood of the mice that receive the LPS and looking at a range of cytokines. And what happens after you inject LPS is that all the cytokines go up, because what happens is macrophages, which are immune cells in your body, can detect LPS. It recognizes it as part of the innate immune response. And through many, many years of evolution, we learned that when we see bacterial cell war, it probably means we're being infected, so we should fight it. So macrophage actually make a range of cytokines, and it releases it to cause an immune response. And we can measure these in the serum. And the cytokines that they measure include things like tumor necrosis factor, TNF, MCP1, which stands for macrophage. I need to look this up.
Monocyte chemotactic protein 1.
Okay, thanks, Vincent. What Vincent said, but it's a chemokine, so it causes immune cells to home to the site of inflammation. In addition, interleukin-6, which is another immunogenic cytokine.
We call it a pro-inflammatory cytokine.
Pro-inflammatory. Thank you for that. Thanks, Vincent. I'm going to rely on you guys to correct my non-immunologist terminology.
In fact, it's one of the cytokines that are produced during severe COVID, in which you can give antibodies to try and lessen the inflammation there. So it can be bad if it's not regulated.
Exactly. Is that tocilizumab? I remember.
Tocilizumab.
Okay. Right. So IL-6 is another cytokine that goes up after you give LPS to cause sepsis. And finally, interferon gamma, which is a very famous cytokine as well. All of these are pro-inflammatory, causes inflammation. So using this, the authors can have a pretty good proxy of the body's immune response to LPS. And what they find is if you do electroacupuncture of this particular acupuncture point, called, let me look it up, ST36 Zhu Sanli acupuncture point. And that in Chinese, it actually translates to 3 mile. No idea why, but it's actually located it's located in your leg. It's actually maybe about.
My question here was, how did they translate a human acupuncture point to a mouse?
Good question.
No idea.
Right, like it's sort of like
so like someone literally, like a poor doctor literally had a human and a mouse next to it and just started stabbing with needles. It's my picture in my head. They somehow I didn't look up how they identified it, but as it turns out, this acupuncture point in human is slightly below your knee, on your shin, off to one side. And it's also similar to the mouse, so below the knee, off to one side. And as it happens, if you look below the acupuncture point, it is close to where your sciatic nerve branches to 2 different nerves. So your sciatic nerve comes down from your hip, down your thigh, and then it branches out to your lower leg into the tibial nerve and another nerve called the common peroneal nerve. It's kind of close to where they branch out. So maybe that site is conserved in the point for the humans and for the rodent, is my guess. But anyway, if you put a needle into this identified acupuncture point and stimulate it electrically, you can suppress all these cytokines that are triggered by the LPS, which serves as a pretty good proxy for an immunosuppressant effect of electroacupuncture. And importantly, talking about whether we need the electricity or not, if you don't turn on the electrode so that you don't pass current, but you just have a needle, so traditional acupuncture, you don't see this immunosuppressant response. And also, they actually did another control study where they used a toothpick, which is kind of like stabbing someone with a spoon. They used a toothpick on the mouse, and it also didn't generate this immunosuppressant response. So it's not just the pain or the pressure. either.
I know how you got an IACUC approval for that.
It was 9 years ago. Anyway, let's move on. And also, Vince, Jason, let me know when you have to go so that I can wrap up, because I know you have to go a bit early today. So it's interesting. So this has already, made me kind of sat up to pay attention, because I really didn't expect acupuncture, with my kind of childhood bias of this being kind of made up fantasy. I didn't expect electroacupuncture to actually do anything. What's interesting is that they were able to identify that it actually requires the sciatic nerve. So again, the nerve that innervate your leg, basically, such that if they were to cut the sciatic nerve and then do the electroacupuncture, the electroacupuncture no longer works. So you get all these cytokines that goes up, and it's not blocked by the electroacupuncture.
You can also stimulate the sciatic nerve and get the same effect.
Oh, exactly. So the next experiment they did was they opened up the sciatic nerve, and then they, instead of electroacupuncture the point through the skin, they just zap the nerve itself, and it reduced all the serum cytokine caused by the LPS. And then a very brief mention is that the mouse is anesthetized during the electroacupuncture. Because unlike humans, if you approach a mouse with a needle, they would not let you do it. So the mice are anesthetized, and then they zap it, and then 15 minutes later, they inject the LPS. So this is the order of sequence. So the timing is actually quite important. We'll get to it in one of the later experiments. But for these experiments, they do the acupuncture first, and then they inject the LPS. And then what they did was that they're able to show that... So a little bit for the next experiment, a very brief background. People have shown that vagal stimulation can actually cause immunosuppressant. Before this paper, they show that it can cause immunosuppressant by actually activating your spleen. And your spleen is what is known as the secondary lymphoid organ. So it is a major immune organ. It's where, for example, some of the B cells might be produced, maybe T cells. Antibodies can come from the spleen. That's what I remember. But it also makes a lot of cytokines. And previous studies have shown that if you stimulate the vagus nerve, it can actually cause an immunosuppressant effect of the cytokines via acetylcholine-dependent mechanism. So acetylcholine is another neurotransmitter that is important. It's actually a neurotransmitter that is used in the parasympathetic nervous system and also by the vagal nerve. So obviously the question, based on this previous study, the question is, well, maybe what we see actually depends on the spleen. So they removed the spleen and redid the experiment with the electroacupuncture, and they found that even though you don't have the spleen, the acupuncture still works. It still causes immunosuppressant. So it suggests that the spleen is not what is causing, is not the driver of the observed effect here. However, when they cut off the vagus nerve, then they blocked the effect of the electroacupuncture. So it still requires the vagus nerve, but the vagus nerve isn't talking to the spleen for this to work. It's talking to something else. So could it be? As it turns out, I don't know how these authors ended up on this organ, but when they cut out your adrenal glands, then it blocked the effect of the electroacupuncture. So adrenal glands are these glands sitting above your kidneys, and they are part of the sympathetic nervous system, and they release things such as epinephrine, which causes your heart rate to go up, and it also causes your blood vessels to shrink. So if you have an anaphylactic shock, that is the thing that would cause you to come back, to cause you to not die. It also releases norepinephrine because it's part of the sympathetic nervous system. So if you cut out the adrenal glands, you actually block the effect of this electroacupuncture. So it is the adrenal gland. And consistent with this, they also gave a drug that actually blocks the release of molecules that are associated with the adrenal glands, such as norepinephrine and epinephrine. And when they did that, it also blocked the effect of electroacupuncture. So they then looked in the blood and see what molecules, what kind of neurotransmitter molecules were induced by electroacupuncture alone. And what they found is if you electroacupuncture the mouse, you get a strong increase in norepinephrine, a slight increase in epinephrine, but unexpectedly also an increase in dopamine. And dopamine, as someone who studies Parkinson's disease, is usually thought of as being a very important neurotransmitter in the brain, where it mediates things like movement and also reward and also perhaps attention and focus. So we talked a little bit about this last week in terms of ADHD. But it is actually super important in the periphery for your sympathetic nervous system because it is actually the required precursor for norepinephrine.
So that was the connection that I didn't know about. That even in the periphery, you need dopamine as a precursor. I thought there would be something else.
Yeah, as it happens, it is super important. And there's an enzyme that we'll come to later on that converts dopamine to norepinephrine. So that's why there's dopamine out in the system. And that might explain why dopamine got upregulated as well, because maybe it needs to be upregulated for it to be converted to norepinephrine. So the chances is maybe it is an effect that is caused by norepinephrine, the classical sympathetic nervous system neurotransmitter. But as it turns out, the next experiment shows that it is actually not norepinephrine. So these authors examined this with a variety of kind of manipulation. One of them is they actually knocked out the receptors that are usually thought to sense norepinephrine in the periphery to mediate its sympathetic nervous system response, which is the adrenergic beta-2. I think people still call it adrenergic, not epinephric. The beta-2 receptor, which senses both epinephrine and norepinephrine. When they knocked it out, electroacupuncture still works. So it suggests it may not be norepinephrine. And also, they gave a chemical that blocks the enzyme that converts dopamine to norepinephrine. And this chemical is called fusaric acid. Never heard of it before, but it exists. And when they do that, they showed that when they did the electroacupuncture, they no longer get an increase of norepinephrine. So the spike didn't happen. They still get an increase in dopamine because dopamine is still triggered by the acupuncture, but it doesn't get converted to norepinephrine. When you get the fusaric acid that blocks the norepinephrine conversion, if it depends on norepinephrine, the electroacupuncture should no longer work, but it still works. So it really suggests it isn't, surprisingly, the norepinephrine that was causing it. And then they also looked at the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla itself, which is the gland that makes both dopamine, as it turns out, and also norepinephrine, and also epinephrine for it to be released. And when they looked at the adrenal gland, what they saw is when you stimulate the mouse with electroacupuncture, it doesn't require LPS. You just zap the mouse beneath the shin. You get an upregulation of this enzyme that actually makes dopamine. So everything suggests that for whatever reasons, when you zap your leg at these acupuncture point, your adrenal glands get activated in a way that depends on the vagus nerve, because they previously showed that if you cut the vagus nerve, you don't get, these reduction of immunosuppressant. Although they didn't specifically test these upregulation with a vagal nerve cut, unfortunately. So it suggests that maybe dopamine is important and not norepinephrine. So that's something that we're going to come back to in a bit. But before that, we're going to quickly go back to the timing issue. So all the up till now, all the experiment done involved first electroacupuncturing the mouse in this puncture point, and then injecting LPS 15 minutes later, and then looking at the response. But if a patient turns up into the emergency room, they usually already have sepsis. So the more clinically relevant question is, in a mouse that has already been injected with LPS or with sepsis already developed, can we actually bring it back down as opposed to preventing it from happening in the first place? So to look at that, they did two versions of experiment. The first one is just the one that makes sense. They injected LPS and then afterwards did the electroacupuncture, and they showed that it can actually bring down, it can still cause the immunosuppressant. And in this experiment, they actually inject a really big dose of LPS that causes 100% death in mice after 2 days. But if they do the electroacupuncture, half the mice actually survived. So it actually helps. And
what happened to the other half?
They died.
Why would you get such a pattern, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. I don't know.
If you do this in people, and this is an old paper you said, so it should have already been trialed.
Exactly. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that at the end, like why, because it's 9 years old, as you said. We don't know why it's variable. Maybe, so it's possible that the stimulation itself is variable because you're literally poking. There's no, X for the spot of where this point is.
But you couldn't just give people dopamine; that wouldn't have the same effect.
That would be the last. So that is the last experiment that they're going to do. Yeah. So that's something that really should be looked at. But to wrap up the timing issue, they have actually tested a second model of sepsis called cecum ligation and puncture model of sepsis. So this is a little bit gross. In this model, they actually open up the mouse's kind of gut, and then they tied up the cecum, which is kind of the initial bit of your large intestine. They ligated it, and the idea is that by ligation, that bit of the cecum would undergo necrosis. In addition, they punctured it. So inside your intestine, there's a lot of microbiota. If you puncture it, they're going to come out and they're going to infect your gut. So all in all, you have organ death, and you also have a kind of a gut space that is now infected with bacteria. It causes this thing called polymicrobial peritonitis, something similar to that.
Because the peritoneum is the cavity that you're talking about.
Right. My term might be slightly off because I didn't. Polymicrobial.
The gut cavity, but it's really the peritoneum.
Peritonitis. Yeah, peritonitis. Sorry, I just thought I should get the exact name right before I get yelled at. But the reason why they do it is I think studies have shown that if you do this kind of slightly yucky model of sepsis, it induces cytokines in the mice that more faithfully mimic sepsis in humans.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so that's why they did it. And in this...
I do have to run, but my question is, did you follow... I mean... at the end of this, you're going to talk about these dopamine agonists and whether they work. But this paper has been cited over 300 times, so I feel like there must be a fair amount of work that's going to be that's been done on this since then, or is that true?
So as far as I didn't dig very deeply. The reason why the main paper that caught my eye that cites this paper was a Nature paper that came out a year ago. So I would quickly mention that I would quickly mention that when I went back to Hong Kong this time, I was talking to my dad, and kind of unprompted, he mentioned that a friend of his recently died from sepsis in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong, as far as I can tell, is kind of a first world, has first world medical care, kind of similar to Singapore. And it's also, if anything, probably the kind of ground zero of East-West fusion. So if there's one place that should be doing kind of trials on acupuncture effectiveness on sepsis, that would be Hong Kong. So
Yeah.
the fact that, so it's anecdotal, but the fact that someone still died recently of sepsis maybe suggests that it's not widely used. So we can imagine difficulties in testing acupuncture in something that can be as acute and as fatal as sepsis. So it might be difficult to
I'm
test.
not talking about acupuncture, but even this dopamine agonist, because
Exactly. So in the last figure, they showed that if you give dopamine agonists, it actually mimics the effect of electroacupuncture.
Right.
So that I don't know. You'd think that maybe in a patient that is about to fail, you would do these last resort tests.
Right.
So I'm guessing it maybe doesn't work, but I really don't know enough. I didn't look up clinical trials. One thing that might be important is timing. So it's possible that...
I mean, it seems to me like once a patient has sepsis, it's almost a reversible cascade of things happening.
Yeah. So like in all these study, the intervention is done kind of early on.
Right.
So even in the cecum ligation, it was done on the first. They did it, and then they wait one day, and then they did the electroacupuncture for 3 days. Yeah. So anyway, that was a pretty...
You need to go, Jason?
I need to go, yeah, but...
So
we can wrap up. It's pretty much done.
No, wait.
We mentioned
Let him go, but I don't want to keep him anymore. Let's let him go. Jason, what you need to do is hang up and then wait for the upload 100%, which should just take seconds, and then you can leave the page.
Yeah, I'll leave the computer open.
Yeah, just hang up so you're not there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jason.
Thanks, Tim. That was a cool paper, though.
It's a nuts paper.
Interesting. I'll see you next time.
Right.
See you, Jason. So yeah, Vincent, I'll quickly go through the next couple of experiments and then we can wrap up actually. Sure. So as mentioned, when the experimenters did this cecum ligation and puncture manipulation, half the mice died if they didn't get any electroacupuncture treatment. But if you give electroacupuncture treatment, they lived even when you give it basically 24 hours after you started puncturing the cecum. So starting the sepsis process. And once again, if you remove the adrenal glands, the adrenal medulla, that would block the effect of the electroacupuncture, suggesting that consistent with the dependency of the adrenal gland. And then the very last figure is what we talked about, testing the dependency of dopamine. So they showed that you can actually give the mice a dopamine agonist. So basically a chemical that mimics the effect of dopamine by binding to dopamine receptors. And specifically, there's a subclass of dopamine receptors called the D1 receptors. If you do that, then it would also suppress all these cytokines triggered by LPS. Even though you don't even have to inject do any acupuncture, you can just bypass it, kind of go downstream of it by giving dopamine. And then conversely, the effectiveness of the electroacupuncture can be blocked if you block dopamine receptors by giving a drug. So all these seems to kind of tie up pretty neatly in a bow that the whole system works, kind of grand summary of the paper. The whole system works by the needle going near the sciatic nerve. You stimulate the sciatic nerve using electricity. Sciatic nerve goes up to the brain. And it is not shown in this paper, but it's shown in the Nature paper a year ago, that this actually activates the nucleus, the origin of the vagal nerve inside the brain, in the medulla. Well, not in the brain, in the medulla. So those neurons get activated, and then your vagal nerve comes back down and triggers the adrenal medulla. So that's actually a very brief mention. The vagal nerve is part of the parasympathetic nervous system. Your adrenal glands are the sympathetic nervous system. And if you look up the parasympathetic nervous system Wikipedia, there's a picture of where the vagal nerve actually innervates and who it talks to. And it's very conspicuously does not talk to the adrenal glands. So it's very surprising that it actually can activate the adrenal gland.
Yeah.
But people have shown that there's a non-canonical activation of the connection to the adrenal gland. Activates the adrenal gland, causes dopamine to be released, and it's the dopamine that actually triggers all these immunosuppressive effect. And what's somewhat interesting is that you can actually do the electric acupuncture in a mouse and then take the blood of that mouse and then use that blood to suppress the increase of cytokine triggered by LPS. So there's a soluble factor in the blood, presumably dopamine, that actually binds to something, perhaps on the macrophage, that induces all these cytokines. And that connection, as far as I can tell, well, it's that connection, how dopamine in the blood causes immunosuppression, is definitely not addressed in this paper. And as far as I can tell, is still not yet known. So those are some of the future direction, I guess.
So you don't know if any subsequent trials have been done in humans, right?
I'm afraid not. And I'm going to guess it's not clinically, it's probably not a resounding success because although I haven't followed sepsis, it's really, so this is just for fun, to celebrate my cousin who got married.
No, it's very interesting though, that there is some physiological effect of acupuncture, right? That you can measure.
Yeah.
The problem I see is that I don't know anything about acupuncture, but it may be that you have to be very precise, and not everybody can do it. And so, in a clinical trial, you would see a difference. But it seems to me that giving the dopamine agonist would be the way to do the clinical trial. Right?
So there might be some complications to that. So, for example, the dopamine agonist that they gave actually is FDA-approved drug to treat hypertension. Mm-hmm. So it itself causes hypotension. So it reduces blood pressure. And one of the effect of sepsis is this thing called septic shock, where your blood pressure goes really low, and it could potentially be fatal. So there are maybe side effects of dopamine that you might not want, that might kind of interfere with its immunosuppressant effect. So things like that can make things a little bit complicated. And that applies to like vagal nerve stimulation and also this electroacupuncture as well. So, but I'm not an expert at all on kind of sepsis clinical trial or acupuncture. So I can't tell whether it is widespread, but as far as I can tell, sepsis is not a solved, easily treatable condition even now to this day. So so it's, for me, this paper is kind of in some sense, I guess, a start. Maybe potentially it's kind of a curiosity, but the author thinks that it might be a potentially interesting approach of a non-invasive way of causing different organs to be either activated or suppressed. So, for example, in the Nature paper that was published a year ago,
sorry about that. My computer was about to run out of juice.
Okay. Sorry, I just kind of kept talking. I saw you left, and I was like, let's not have dead air, and let's just keep rambling on.
So I just looked up sepsis and acupuncture, and there was a meta-review done in 2019 which said there was basically no clinical trial data in humans.
So I actually don't know how. So I think acupuncture might be hard to do clinical trials on, but like D1 agonists or dopamine agonists might be a bit easier to do.
Anyway, I think this is very interesting.
I kind of thought I'd get it out of my system. It's one of those curious papers.
I appreciate that was it your brother got married?
No, my cousin, my cousin who's much younger than me, and it's kind of scary that he's getting married.
So he married a doctor who practices acupuncture, right?
She's a doctor of Chinese medicine. So acupuncture is, I'm guessing, one of the things that she does. So I don't know what the specialization of Chinese medical doctors are. Like, I don't know if they are equivalent of neurologists or pediatric surgeons, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you, Tim. I think that was really cool.
Thanks, Vincent.
I enjoyed it. And the experiments are done properly. They have all the controls. They
right.
do things
Yeah.
logically.
So it shows that something as wacky. I mean, I'm in some sense biased because I grew up with it and I watch it on TV. But something as potentially wacky as Chinese medicine can be studied scientifically. But things like healing someone using your qi like 1,000 miles away, I think there's no need to study that.
Yeah. But this shows that putting needles in, at least electroacupuncture, has a specific physiological effect, right?
Yeah, and in fact, the paper from a year ago looked at a different acupuncture point in the stomach, and they showed that because in the stomach, the nerve that are around the acupuncture points travel to a different place. In fact, travel is quite close to the spleen. You actually cause a spleen activation if you do that. So there are these, I'm guessing people who practice acupuncture and actually do it for a living would tell you these are kind of highways of nerves through your body that might have unintended side effect that you can pretty much take advantage of by stimulating it. So it's kind of a form of biohacking to maybe specifically control specific organs, that kind of stuff. Yeah. But obviously,
all right, thank you.
Many more studies required.
Yeah, I think it seems to me that it should be followed up because there's something here. Yeah, but it's been a long time and there's nothing, so I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, so this is just for fun.
All right, so thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Vincent.
The show notes for TWiN you can find at microbe.tv/TWiN. If you have any questions or comments, TWiN@microbe.tv. If you like what we do, consider supporting us financially. We depend on your help to make these programs. Microbe.tv/contribute. Well, Jason Shepard, who already left, he's at the University of Utah. He's Jason Synaptic on Twitter. And Tim Chung is at New York University. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Vincent. It was fun.
I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at microbe.tv. You've been listening to This Week in Neuroscience. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week.